But it makes a better story. It makes, when you get this little kid coming over for banjo lessons, you tell him that story, his eyes get as big around as saucers. And, it's a much better story if he thinks you actually killed the cat.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast. You're all looking fantastic today. I'm really happy you could join me. My name is Keith Billick, your host. I'll give a special welcome to anybody who's just checking out the show for the first time. Really glad to have you. There's always room for more here. And also special thanks for anyone who's been a more long-time listener. I really appreciate the dedication and appreciate you downloading all the episodes. Along those same lines, if you enjoy this podcast, there are ways you can support what I do. The main way is to go to the Patreon page and make a financial contribution that helps keep this whole machine running. That address is patreon.com/banjopodcast. The other ways are just spreading the word to all your friends, get any banjo players you know listening, subscribe and rate the podcast on any of the platforms that you use to download it. All of that helps. Leave me comments. You can also directly leave me comments by emailing the show. The email address is pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com. And I always try to get back to you if you email me there, and I love hearing from the listeners. For those of you who have heard at least a couple episodes of this show before, you're going to notice that this one is a little bit of a change of pace, and that's for a few different reasons. The main reason is because the special guest on this episode is a gentleman named Bradley Laird, and traditionally I've had strictly either banjo performers, or I know I had Tom Neckville, who's a banjo builder, where banjo is their thing. Bradley is a banjo player and has been for a long time, but that's really not his claim to fame, and it's not how I encountered him. A lot of you know my story, and Bradley and I talk about it on this episode, so I'm not going to go back into it. But in a nutshell, I was looking for other bluegrass podcasts before I started this one, and Bradley hosts a podcast called Grass Talk Radio, and he's going to talk all about it on this episode. But that was my introduction to him, was finding his podcast in my search. And I found his show to be a really useful resource to all sorts of musicians, whether you're a beginner on through professional or advanced people. He talks about a lot of aspects of the music business and being a musician that you don't always get from videos or instructional books. Speaking of that, he is also the author of a lot of different instructional materials, and he'll tell you all about that on the episode and how to find his materials. So at any rate, I really enjoyed chatting with him. Another difference of this podcast is that, so a lot of you actually email me. A pretty common email that I get from you listeners is suggestions for special guests on the podcast, and those are great. I love hearing about the names that you want to hear. However, a lot of the responses that I give back to you are, hey, I only do podcasts, or I only do the interviews in person because I really like to have a high sound quality, and I just feel like you can get a better conversation with somebody for obvious reasons when you are looking at them and seeing them in person, as opposed to over the phone or over Skype or something like that. I made an exception for this one, mostly because Bradley, being a podcaster, I knew that he had the recording technology and some microphones. So this podcast was recorded over Facebook chat, but we did a pretty good job, I think, of maintaining that high quality. We had to do some audio magic to get each other the sound files and put them all together. But it turned out really well. But another aspect of that is any of you who have tried FaceTime or Skype or anything like that, you know that on the video chats, there's that slight delay. So if there are portions where we're either talking over each other or we're not responding very quickly, it's because there's that little bit of delay, and you're always a bit self-conscious. You don't want to start talking, and then by that time the other person has started talking, and then you're interrupting each other because of the delay in the video, and that's frustrating. So there's a little bit of that, but no big deal. Another cool difference is that, seeing as how both Bradley and I each have our own podcasts, we decided that we are actually going to release this exact same episode for both shows. So you will see this appear as the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast, but if you go check Bradley's Grass Talk Radio Podcast, you will get to hear the exact same episode again, except with his introduction instead of mine. In fact, I'll have to go check out, see what he's saying about me. So to sum it up, as opposed to the typical conversation all about banjos and bridges and heads and J.D. Crowe techniques, this one kind of focuses more on podcaster to podcaster and our backgrounds and what it takes putting our shows together. And I found it really interesting, and I hope you do too. So here we go. Bradley Laird, the host of the Grass Talk Radio Podcast. So hey Bradley, it's really nice to meet you in person. I know we've been chatting over the internet, and I've heard quite a few episodes of your podcast. So pleasure to get to talk to you.
Well, it's good to talk to you too, and I've watched your podcast with interest. When it first popped up, I think I saw it on Banjo Hangout.
Okay.
And I saw it, and I thought, now here is a brave guy. I thought my podcast was for a small slice of the universe. I mean, you can't get much more niche than people who, not bluegrass fans, but people who actually play bluegrass, and then you're brave enough to come along and whittle it down. It's a toothpick now.
Players. Yeah, exactly.
That is a niche within a niche within a niche.
I have a way of making sure that I can't possibly make a living from whatever my hobby ends up being.
Let's not get on that topic. Oh my God.
Oh yeah, that'd be a non-starter.
It's like that old Steve Martin joke. How do you make $1 million playing bluegrass? You start with $2 million.
Start with $2 million. Works every time. So hey, I know a lot of your listeners might be familiar with your background and whatnot. Mine almost certainly aren't. I imagine we have some overlap in listenership, but just for the sake of making sure everyone's on the same page, why don't you go through kind of what your musical background is, how you came to bluegrass? Yeah, just get us started with that.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a household of all the kids in the house played band instruments. We were all in the band. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of assigned to play the French horn, even though I didn't even know what it was. My mother apparently liked the French horn. She was a church organist and a pianist and taught piano lessons. When I was a kid, there'd be like neighborhood kids coming in and out after school getting piano lessons.
Yeah.
So I kind of grew up in that environment. Everybody in the house played an instrument except my father. In fact, he mumbled in church. He didn't actually sing. He was the most non-musical guy that you've ever encountered. He didn't even own a record.
A joyful noise is all they require, right? In church?
Well, he did a lot of other things in the church. He would be like the guy, counting the money in the collection plates and a deacon and stuff like that.
Okay.
And on church committees and stuff. But the guy just music wasn't his thing.
Uh-huh.
But luckily for me, my mother was what I would consider highly musical. So she got us in band and, singing in the church choir and stuff like that. But I didn't know what a banjo was. I was born in Indiana. I was born in Lafayette, Indiana.
Okay.
And my folks were from Rensselaer, Indiana, which is about halfway between Indianapolis and Chicago. There were no banjo pickers around there. I think my first banjo experience was seeing Jerry Van Dyke playing the tenor banjo on TV.
Wow. Okay.
And I saw some banjo players on the Lawrence Welk show because my grandmother liked to watch Lawrence Welk. And so I'd see these banjo players. I knew what a banjo was, but I had no clue about bluegrass. I'd never even heard that. Well, we ended up moving to Georgia when I was going into the 3rd grade.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't any different down here. I mean, the thing was, in the late 60s, Hee Haw came on and the Beverly Hillbillies.
Right.
And a little bit of that Darlin family stuff on Andy Griffith. So I began to hear some bluegrass banjo and some bluegrass type sounds, but I really didn't know anything about it at all.
Yeah.
But I had a friend of mine in the 6th grade. He was my best friend, and I'd go over to his house, and we'd play in the woods and catch snakes and frogs and stuff. And when we come back in the house at the end of the night, his brother played the banjo. And I remember hearing him in his bedroom playing the banjo.
Yeah, cool.
It turns out his father was a guy named Charles Jackson, who for many, many years was the festival promoter at the J Bluegrass Festival, the old J Bluegrass Festival, where Bill Monroe played. And it was a very popular North Georgia Bluegrass Festival probably started in the late 60s and through the 70s. Fast forward a few years, my mother worked at the library, and they had these record albums that you could go in and put on some headphones and play records. And I found this record called Songs of the Ozarks, and I put it on. And what I was hearing was clawhammer banjo. I didn't know it at the time, but I got really, really excited hearing this thing. And it was probably Uncle Dave Macon and stuff like that on this. I don't know what was on this record exactly. Right. I don't have the record. I had to return it to the library.
But whatever it was kind of new stuff to you. Yeah.
Man, I'd never heard anything like this. So I became obsessed. I got the Foxfire book. I built myself a banjo. Cool. I got Earl Scruggs' book and record and started trying to figure it out. This is probably in about 1975, thereabouts. I was probably 16. Mm-hmm. But I'd still never actually seen anybody play bluegrass. I didn't know anybody that played bluegrass. My friends at school, they were into, playing ZZ Top and stuff. They were all playing electric instruments. And I had this Earl Scruggs record, and I brought it to school one day, and I took a kid that I thought I might be able to talk into being my guitarist, and took him in the library and took him in the back room and put that record on. And I thought, well, this will convince him because he's got Bob Dylan on here. I think it was called Earl Scruggs Family and Friends, the first version. Had Joan Baez and stuff like that. And I thought, Bob Dylan, now I've heard that name. This guy will probably know who that is, and that'll get him interested in playing bluegrass. Well, I played it, and he just stood there like, huh? What?
It didn't work, huh?
No, it totally didn't work. So, a few years of that, I went to college. And I at that point, I was playing banjo for a couple of years. I had a mandolin, I had a guitar, I had a fiddle, I had a bass, but I had this burning desire to be in a bluegrass band. That's all I cared about. I didn't even care what I studied in college.
Right.
I ultimately did study forestry. I'm down there, and the first guy that walks up to my dorm room door, he saw me carting all them cases and my bass fiddle and all this stuff up to my dorm room. And this guy came over, knocked on the dorm room door, and said, hey, are you Bud Laird? I said, yes, which is, I wasn't. But I said yes, and he called me Bud for the rest of my life. He had a banjo in his hand. And I was like, oh, man, do you play anything else? Because, at that time, all I wanted to do was play banjo. He was like, no, I just play banjo. I'm like, well, okay, let's pick. And I ended up being a mandolin player. And for 35 years, I've always played mandolin on stage, but I've always been a closet banjo picker, and I still play banjo today. Anyway, that's kind of how I got into it.
So that's quite a relief for me, because I was all nervous about ruining my brand here, interviewing a guy who I thought I knew you played mandolin and bass, and I know you have banjo-oriented materials, but I really didn't think that was your thing. So I'm really relieved to know that that's your true passion. So I'm staying with my theme here.
It was my first passion.
Yeah,
actually, there was about a 3-month period right before that I was going to be a fiddle player. That was, I'm going to play the fiddle. And I had a borrowed fiddle from a guy that lived up the street from us, a friend of my brother's. Well, he came to the door one day and knocked on the door and said, we're moving, I got to have my fiddle back. And there went the fiddle and all my fiddle dreams.
So much for that. Right.
Which is probably a good thing, because I still monkey around with a fiddle, but I'm the worst fiddle player you have ever heard.
Well, you haven't heard me yet, so a race to the bottom.
You have to dedicate your life to being a fiddle player.
Yeah.
You just can't sort of play the fiddle. You either do or don't, and I wasn't the guy to do it. So I moved to banjo immediately. But, I've been known as a mandolin player And I think I'm a pretty decent mandolin player, but I've always, in the back of my mind, had that I'm still a banjo player. You know, in my house, there are banjos everywhere. I think I have maybe, I don't know, 3 mandolins. I probably got 12 banjos.
Oh, that's great.
Here.
That's great.
And most of them are just old funky stuff that I made, some fretless. I got into building those Foxfire plans banjo because I made the very first one. That was the first banjo I had. I swear to God, this is true. I went in the backyard and I took a fence post from our fence, and it was a cedar 4x4, and whittled that into the neck. And the you've probably seen those Foxfire plans.
Yeah, I have.
And the body is basically 3 pieces of wood, about 12 inches in diameter, circles, and you stack them up and screw them together.
Right.
That was my closet shelf from my bedroom. My parents didn't know where I got the wood. I just come in there one day, look what I made, you know.
All these things just keep going missing from your home, your fence posts,
right,
and your
exactly right,
bedroom shelf.
Exactly right. And I don't want to talk about the cat that went missing.
Was that from your fiddle career? You needed some strings?
No, that was I actually had an old tambourine that I scored the head off of, but I always tell people I used a cat skin, which wasn't true.
Just freak
But it makes
out.
a better story. It makes, when you get this little kid coming over for banjo lessons, you tell him that story, his eyes get as big around as saucers, and, it's a much better story if he thinks you actually killed the cat.
It's a lot more dedication, yeah, for sure.
But that banjo, I still have that banjo. And I did monkey around with clawhammer a little bit, but basically once I heard Earl Scruggs and hearing Bill Keith, and I got an album very early on that was the Bean Blossom Live two record set.
Yeah.
And it was just like You're There, and it was Jimmy Martin, and it was everybody. Mm-hmm. And I think Jack Hicks was playing with Bill Monroe then, and Carl Jackson was on that record and just played this insanely fast version of, I think it was Orange Blossom Special.
Right, yeah.
And the melodic phase was really coming on strong in the mid-'70s. So I got just eat up with that. I mean, that's all I wanted to do was play melodic. I wanted to play I wanted to do the Bobby Thompson never-ending descending and ascending runs and all that stuff. But all along that, I ended up getting in bands and playing mandolin, and really, my banjo playing kind of sat on the side, and it still does. But if somebody needs a banjo player, holler at me.
Right.
But anyway, so I kind of led this dual life of being known as a mandolin player who's completely insane about the banjo.
Bring us then to what made you want to start a podcast about all this stuff. Maybe real quick, introduce your podcast itself, because for any of my listeners who aren't familiar with the fact that you have a podcast, that's kind of how we ended up meeting each other online, is because, you have introduce what your podcast is and how you decided to do that as well.
Well, the podcast that I have is called Grass Talk Radio, and it lives at grasstalkradio.com. All the episodes are up there. I just passed the 100 episode mark.
Yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. You're up to you're getting in the 20s now. You're going to catch me if I don't hurry up.
We'll see about that. More. Yeah, I'll do my best.
I had a very specific reason for starting the podcast, and I'd been listening to some podcasts. I got an iPod for Christmas. This is back in, I don't know, 2004 or something. Mm-hmm. And when you pulled up the little menu, it said podcast. And I was like, I don't even know what that is.
Right.
And so I got on and found how to speak French, the Learn French podcast. And I started listening to this stuff on the way back and forth to work. That was sort of my introduction into podcasts. I was like, this is cool, because when I was a kid, I used to listen to radio a lot. I'd listen to baseball games on the radio at night, have my little AM radio in my earphone.
Yeah.
I had a crystal radio set, and, I was always listening to stuff. And I thought, podcasts, this is great, because I don't really like what's on the radio. I don't really like what's on TV. Here I can pick out something I'm interested in and listen to it. So I found out what podcasts were, and then fast forward a few years, and I got into doing instructional materials for an outfit called Watch and Learn. And they had banjo and guitar and electric guitar and jazz and keyboards and bass and drums and harmonica and all these instruction books, which people have probably seen in music stores. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have much of anything for mandolin. And the guys, a guy named Jeff Howald, who's a banjo player.
Yeah.
And he had a book called The Banjo Primer, which is probably sold more copies than Earl's book. It's because it's just in every little music store. Well, Jeff contacted me. I knew him. He was in the Atlanta area. And he said, hey, we want to do some mandolin stuff. So I got into doing mandolin instruction videos for them. Well, the problem was, as you could probably tell, I kind of like to talk. And we were trying to basically produce 20-minute videos where you're going to teach them how to do something. You know, it could be chords, it could be songs, it could be whatever.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's the director over there. There's the teleprompter guy and the cameraman sitting there looking at you, and they're all watching their clock, and they got stopwatches and stuff.
And they're tapping their feet, yeah.
Yeah, and so I always felt really pressured to stay on task, teach the stuff, don't go off on a 5-minute tangent about, hey, remember that time we, you know. So I felt like there was a lot of missing information. And then it dawned on me that a podcast could fill in all that stuff. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't know if you teach lessons, but I've taught lessons for many, many years, private lesson students.
Yeah, I have in the past, yeah.
Okay, so you know how it goes. Mm-hmm. You got your 30-minute window, and you try to stay on task for that. But then maybe the next student doesn't show up, and you and the student sit there and shoot the breeze for an hour. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, some really valuable stuff gets imparted to the student during that time, you know?
Yeah,
and
when
so
the pressure is off, right.
Well, yeah, you don't have a clock running.
Sure.
And so you can tell this long-winded tale and, you know. And so that's what I viewed the podcast as. I want to not have a clock running where I could talk for an hour if I want to. Mm-hmm. And I could talk about crazy subjects that if somebody thinks it's not all that important to them, fine, they can just hit stop, you know. They don't have to listen to it.
Sure.
So it's all the things, you know, all the other things that nobody would ever pay for, you know. They're not going to pay to hear me tell a story about, oh, the time I met Earl Scruggs, you know.
Right.
Who would buy that? So you just give it away.
In the bathroom, right?
That is right.
Yeah.
You have listened. I did.
Did my homework,
Great Southeast Music Hall. Well, so that's basically it. It's just a long form way to, you know, pass along some information to other people.
Right.
And so that's what Grass Talk Radio is. And I have had some guests on the show. I had Mike Marshall, the mandolin player.
Yeah.
I've had, you can go over there to grasstalkradio.com and see who I've interviewed. And we're kind of interviewing each other here right now. So I've tried to break it up with that because, you know, after a while, people have probably heard enough of what I have, you know. You begin to wonder, did I tell that story already? You know, I don't know. And I don't have time to go back and listen to it all. So
they'll just have to hear it again. Yeah.
Bring other people in. So I'm, you know, trying to interview some folks. And I always try to I try to make it not topical. I don't want to ask someone like, tell me about your new album and where you're playing next month and things that are time sensitive. I always try to steer it towards, you know, how'd you get started? How do you practice? What do you think? You know, how tight do you tighten your head? You know, that kind of stuff. I try to get it down to information that would be maybe not asked. Let's say, you know, Bela Fleck was interviewed on NPR. They're not going to ask him about his tailpiece. But I am, you know. So and I think that's kind of what you're doing there, too. So to throw it back to you, what possessed you to start the Picky Fingers Banjo podcast?
It was sort of a necessity being the mother of invention kind of situation. I have my day job. I won't go into it too much, but suffice to say that it's kind of a boring desk job. And I therefore became a consumer of a lot of podcasts sitting at my desk doing my job. And as everyone does, you find the ones that suit your interests. So you start listening to those. So I have my various ones, but it always kind of bothered me that I'm really passionate about banjos and banjo music, and I was not really able to find one that really scratched that itch, I guess. Yours would be one of the closest ones that I found, but it still wasn't quite that banjo podcast that I wanted. And so I kind of mulled it over for about a year. A year of thinking about this, like, man, someone should really start this. Someone really needs to do this. And it kind of dawned on me, like, well, I know a thing or two about banjos. I've participated in a lot of different aspects of the banjo world. I'm a player. I learned as an adult, so I've had the experience recently of knowing what it's like to learn things on a new instrument.
Yeah.
I worked in retail for 10 years selling banjos and banjo parts.
Did you?
I've been a sound guy.
Don't want to interrupt, but where did you work?
I worked at Elderly Instruments. I was the showroom manager there for about 10 years.
How about that? I love Elderly. I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm going to throw it right back to you.
Yeah, that's fine.
I credit Elderly with helping me out a lot, because before I got into doing all those instruction videos with Watch and Learn, mm-hmm. I wrote a mandolin book, and I've got a podcast about it called The Masterclass Story. And I wrote a mandolin instruction book. And Elderly, I sent them a little thing, and I said, hey, I have this book. I've sent them a sample of it.
Right.
And they stocked it, and they sold it. And,
oh, cool. I'm sure I saw
it. That really launched the whole thing. Yeah, I got a lot of love for Elderly, and in fact, one of my banjos that I own came from Elderly.
Very cool.
I've got a Ritberg and Lang Orpheum number 1,
all right,
5-string.
Yeah,
that
cool.
I bought. It was up there on consignment, and I sold the banjo through them one time. And I love Elderly. That's the first place I go when I need strings and so on. But anyway, so
me too.
Take over. But back to you.
Yeah, so I had identified this gap in the podcast universe, and the more I thought about it, like I have all these different types of banjo experiences. I'm not like a top-notch player. I don't necessarily know all of these professionals, but I know a handful of them, and it's probably enough, and why don't I just do it? And so finally I just decided that I was going to do it, and as you do, you just step by step figure out one thing after the other of what it takes to actually put this thing out there. And fortunately like I said, I've been a sound guy, so actually just getting the microphones together and getting something recorded wasn't too big of a deal, but it was a learning curve to learn about the hosting and what's involved in actually making it show up on people's phones and
right.
Make it so that people can listen to it. And it's almost like magic when you pull out your phone and you see something that you did just pop up on the screen, and you're like, wow, it's kind of amazing that we can do that. But, so that's what did it. And even as I put out those first few episodes, I was really not sure. I was like, I'll give a stab at this, and I'm not sure how it'll go. And if it wasn't for a lot of positive response that I got, and just listener feedback and encouragement from the people who I was talking to, who knows, I might have given up. But I got nothing but positive feedback and encouragement, so that really powered me through. And since then, I've been able to talk with a lot of, frankly, my heroes from the banjo world and some really impressive people. And so I'm just consistently gracious or grateful, I guess, for them being generous with their time. It's not like I pay these people to appear on the podcast. I don't have any money to do that. So they're doing it out of their love for the banjo. And so I'm just happy to be the person who kind of puts it all together and puts it out there, and hopefully people enjoy it.
Yeah, I certainly have enjoyed it. I've been listening since I think I heard of it, and you were probably at about episode 2.
Okay.
I think you had Alan Mundy, but I was like, wow, this guy is doing some good stuff. And I listen to all of them, and I encourage all of my listeners to go over there. In fact, I did a podcast called Podcast Shoutouts. And this was, I don't remember, it's been back probably in the episode 70-ish, somewhere along in there, where I couldn't think of anything to talk about that day. And I said, well, I'm just going to pull up my iPod here and just
the other
rattle
podcast.
off all the podcasts I listened to, and you were one of them. And I think at that point you were maybe into, I don't know, episode 5 or 6.
Single digits still, yeah.
Yeah. But, you see a lot of podcasts come and go. And,
sure,
there are an awful lot of podcasts listed on iTunes that only have 3 episodes, and that's just it. And I have the benefit with mine that ultimately I am a capitalist pig, and I am hoping that, the listeners of the podcast may stroll over to the website and they might actually buy something, and then I might be able to buy gas for the car.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So I do have an ulterior motive, but I also enjoy doing it. I really like having that, well, what am I going to do this week? Kind of thing. And it's kind of like going and playing a not so good paying gig. It's still fun, even though you might not come home with $300 in your pocket. It's still fun. However, I will say this, there is a limit to that. I mean, I think, that's probably why some podcasts disappear. At a certain point, maybe they're not getting very high listener counts, download counts, and they don't really have a way to monetize it, which is a way to measure, its effectiveness. And you see people try ads, you can have, like, I've listened to some podcasts and up comes an ad for Napa Auto Parts or something, And
yeah.
I'm like, how did that get on there? There are ways, and that does keep the wheels greased because there is, as you know, there is some cost. It's fairly small, but to do this requires, even equipment. I used to record them all on a little Zoom H2 digital recorder. That would be my capturing device. Well, I turned it on one day and it died. In fact, it died on the day I was going to interview Mike Marshall.
Oh, no.
And I had to postpone because it was just dead. Wouldn't turn on. So, you got to go out and find a replacement. So there are costs. So I'm encouraging everybody to support you, so that,
yeah, and likewise,
even if it's a small way to help keep it going, if you like it. I mean, if you don't like it,
then they're not listening to this anyway if they don't.
That's exactly right.
No, with me, it's mostly the highest cost by far is time. It does take a lot of time to plan and arrange the interviews, to do what it takes to show up to the right place, to record the interviews. I do a lot of on location. I'll go out to venues to record people. Yeah. Then, of course, you travel with that, and then editing and mixing it. Yeah, but by the time you get done with an episode, you've put in quite a few hours with it, and hopefully that's not too noticeable. Hopefully it just sounds smooth and perfect, and nobody even thinks about it. But that's probably the biggest cost for me is just the time. Yeah, and I know exactly what you're saying. I mean, even if I'm not interviewing somebody, there's the thought process before you even turn on anything. Like, what am I going to say? Writing notes and little outlines and ideas. I have spent, full days just doing a 45-minute show. Oh, easy.
By the time I get it all done, I mean, it's just, and now it's released. I do a little graphic for each episode, which I don't think all the podcast feeds pull that up. I host mine on Podbean, but I do a little show-specific graphic for each one. You got to write a description. I got the show notes page on my own site.
Yeah,
there's like 50 steps to getting it from I woke up to you're now listening to this.
And as soon as you're done with one, then you start over again with what's the next one going to be.
Right. There's that feeling of relief when it goes out and you see, people are downloading it. Wow, that's great. And then you're like, oh, but what am I going to do next time?
Yeah, I mean, I work sort of like you do. We're just doing this on our own. It's not like we have a boss that's giving us a deadline on these. But I try to keep myself to roughly like an every other week schedule. Yeah. Sometimes I cheat by a few days or so. Yeah, I don't know how many times I'll put out an episode and think I can breathe for a few days. And I get to the end of that first week and like, okay, I have another week before I really need to get one done. I should dive into this. And then I realize, no, it actually has been 2 weeks. I need to do it now.
Time passes.
Time goes really quickly.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
One time my wife and son went out of town and I said, I'm going to knock out 4 episodes while I'm gone.
Yeah, right.
And I did. I mean, every day I got up and make a new podcast, and I had them lined up and scheduled. And I was like, I'm sitting back, laying in the hammock, just watching them come out, got them scheduled and they're releasing and everything. And then I was like, oh my God, the last one just went up. I got to get back on
back to work. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you another thing, which I know you're aware of, and hopefully it's not occurring here, but is the little weird technical snafus, like you think you got it. And a lot of people probably don't realize this, and I'll bet you do this, is that when you get all done and you've edited it and you've uploaded it, and then you got to listen to it one more time, start to finish, because you want to make sure, there wasn't this little thing happening.
Yeah, something really crazy didn't happen.
You got to listen to it. So you just spent all day doing this thing, and then you're walking around, or me, I'm walking around the yard with my iPod listening to the whole thing again before I finally hit publish,
Yeah.
And there, in the beginning I was being more of a perfectionist. If I heard a little buzz or something, or if I'd stumble over my words, there was one example, you get to talk and sometimes you just say the dumbest thing. One time I was talking about instrument cases, and I think it's in the episode called Instrument Horror Stories. Okay. But anyway, I said, okay, look, if you want to protect your instrument, make sure you always put your case inside your instrument.
Yeah.
It's totally backwards.
Right.
But I didn't know that when I did it. And I listened back to that and I thought, should I go back in there? And I've gotten to the point now where I just go, you know what? I'm human. Little things are going to happen. I'm not worrying about every little misstate. I'm just not going to fret over that stuff, and probably a lot of people don't even notice them.
Well, but, that actually, oh yeah, totally. Yeah. And if you've done a good job of editing that stuff, I do still obsess a little bit over, I'll let quite a few things slip by, but if there's a bunch of about
episode 100, you'll probably stop obsessing over it.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it.
I was the same way. I mean, I worried over every little click, and if it's not too gross, because most people are going to just listen to it one time and move on. So I figure, I'm not going to win a Grammy for this recording, so I don't worry over it quite as much as I used to.
That actually, yeah, I mean, that kind of leads into the next thing I wanted to talk about. What I know we're probably each our own harshest critics about these things, but what do you kind of view as your relative strengths and weaknesses as a podcast host?
Well, I don't really even consider myself a host because of the low number of interviews I do. Mm-hmm. I do enjoy the interviews, and I probably, out of the 100 episodes that I've done over the last 2 years, I probably have, 14 or so interviews. So I haven't set myself up as, hey, I'm interviewing people. So I don't really think of myself as the host. I just think of myself as the guy that's going to turn on the mic and tell you stories and, give you tips and advice. And basically that well is going to run dry at some point. I mean, so I don't know where this thing is going. I may lean back more towards bringing people on. I had a problem. I was really ramping up, and I was trying to do an interview. Every third episode would be an interview, and then I was going to work to every other one would be an interview, and I would gradually transition over to just interviews in order to keep this going.
Right. And
I had a problem with my computer died, so I had to revert back to an older Mac. It wouldn't run Skype. I was doing them all with Skype at that time, and it just shut me down. I'm like, okay, well, I'll figure out another method, and like we're doing right now, we're using Facebook chat to actually do this recording, but that kind of put the brakes on that. But you ask about strengths and so on. I think the thing that I'm really trying to do, and I hope I am accomplishing, is that there's a lot more to being a bluegrass musician than knowing how to play.
Yeah.
That side, I've got some materials for that, and there's plenty of that information out there, how to play. But there's a whole lot of other stuff,
Yeah.
I did an episode on how to schedule, how to keep track of your calendar when you've got a band, how to herd cats, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
I did an episode called 10 Good Gadgets, and it was just stuff that I have found extremely useful running around playing gigs. I talked for 15 minutes about hand trucks. And,
Yeah, that's probably my favorite aspect of your podcast, is that these are things that affect basically every single musician, at least once you get to the point of playing gigs or whatever. And a lot of your episodes even address the things that happen before you get to that point.
Yeah. I just tried to bring the real world aspects of it, even if you're just a jammer or you're starting a band. I did a series of 5 or 6 episodes about that whole process of starting a band, writing set lists, how to rehearse. I'm basically trying to think about all those things that I've learned over doing this for 40 years and see if I can put it together in some sort of cogent form that maybe might save somebody else a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, that's valuable stuff, definitely.
Well, that remains to be seen. If it's still around here 100 years from now and people are still listening to it, then I will say, yeah, it was pretty valuable. But
if you keep paying your hosting dues, it'll be there whether you want it to or not.
Yeah, that's right. One of the issues that I have as a podcaster is being able to measure. I can see the download count, but I can't, like, if somebody comes over to my site and buys my $5 jam session survival book and downloads it, I don't know if they did that because they just rambled through the internet and happened upon my website and found it and bought it and have never even heard the podcast, or did they hear the podcast where I talked about that? I don't really know.
Yeah.
So I figure, well, it must be doing something, so I'll just keep doing it. Maybe that's not true at all, but it
can't hurt, right?
Well, yeah, but I do wish I knew. And I started a little thing. I have this thing called the Grass Talk Radio Supporter Pack, which is they can go into my little store and kick in any dollar amount they want. I keep making the joke that I'm hoping some lottery winner will come along and throw down about $100,000 at some point. But when somebody does that, then that is a clear vote that, hey, I like your podcast, and here's $10.
Yeah.
And that, there have been a few times I've thought about quitting. I'll be honest. I mean, you just like, gosh, I just don't know if this is worth all the time that I'm putting in. Mm-hmm. And then, bing, and you get this little email and it says, so-and-so just sent you $5. And you're like, oh man, now I gotta keep going.
You can't let them down. Yeah.
That's right.
No, that is a really nice feeling, for sure.
Where are you located, Keith?
I'm in a town called Ferndale, Michigan, which is just outside of Detroit. It's like one of the next towns north of Detroit.
Growing up in Indiana, I went through Detroit one time in my life. At one time, we had a family vacation when I was in about the 5th grade.
All right.
And we had a family vote. Where are we going to go? And it basically came down to Florida, and we were living in Atlanta then. Florida or Canada? And I'd been reading Field and Stream magazines and seeing those pictures of these guys holding up these giant trout and stuff. And I was really into fishing as a kid, or fishing in the creek and stuff.
Yeah.
And all I wanted to do was go to Canada and catch this giant lake trout or something. And I lobbied and talked the family into taking a family vacation to Canada. And all we did was drive through absolute nothingville.
Oh, yeah.
But we went through Detroit and we crossed over at Sault Ste. Marie and drove all the way
up there. Holy cow.
We went all the way to Niagara Falls and crossed back into the U.S. and then drove back to Georgia and did that in about a 6-day period. All we did was drive. So I didn't get to hang around Detroit very long, but I know we went through it.
Yeah.
Crazy.
A lot of people don't realize that about Michigan is if you include the Upper Peninsula, there are places I could probably drive to your place. You're down pretty close to Atlanta?
I'm 2 hours south of Atlanta. I'm down if you remember President Jimmy Carter,
Sure.
he was from Plains, Georgia. I live in the same county as Plains, Georgia.
Yeah, I mean,
County, Georgia.
I could probably drive to your home from Detroit in less time. There are places I could drive in Michigan that would take me longer to get to than it would take me to get to you.
Yeah.
Up in the Upper Peninsula. So that it's kind of a little more sprawling than people sometimes give it credit for.
Yeah, that's some serious wilderness when you get up there.
Oh, it's great. It's great.
From what I recall of it. And, you know, I've listened to some deer hunting podcasts and things like that. And those guys always talk about, you know, the big woods up in the Upper Peninsula and all that stuff.
Yeah, I'm still a bit more of a city mouse. You know, I don't get too into the hunting or fishing, but I do appreciate having that, knowing that it's up there and getting to visit from time to time. It's really great.
Well, I do a good bit of it down here. When you live in Sumter County, Georgia, 2 hours south of Atlanta, and we don't even have an interstate highway that passes through the county, frankly, there's nothing else to do down here.
Just play some bluegrass and catch some fish.
Yeah, go fishing, deer hunting. I've raised some chickens, and I've got some donkeys, dog, cat, you know, and mostly I cut grass. I just have a never-ending grass cutting, you know, thing. But it's winter now, so I'm not cutting grass. But
good.
That's about all I do these days, and dream of the next bluegrass festival.
Woo! Need more of those for sure. So hey, I vowed to keep you on brand for my banjo podcast. Why don't you tell me about who you mentioned a few of your favorite players, you know, those melodic guys from the 70s, but who do you kind of view as your favorite banjo players these days?
Well, these days would be I would answer that differently, because when I started, Earl, Ralph Stanley, Don Reno. I mean, that's who I was listening to.
Yeah.
And then I got into Alan Mundy, and pretty early on, Peter Wernick and Tony Trischka. I had that album, that country cooking record, 14 Instrumentals, I think it's called.
Yeah, with both of them on it.
Yeah, with both of them on it. And, you know, that was just blowing my mind. And frankly, that Dueling Banjos album with Eric Weisberg and Steve Mandel.
Yeah.
The stuff, the other tunes that were on there were mind-blowing to me back in those days. So that's what I was into. And, of course, over the years, you know, I got into listening to Bela Fleck. Through being a fan of Newgrass Revival, we opened for Newgrass Revival a couple times in Atlanta in the 80s. And, you know, got to meet those guys.
Uh-huh.
And so, you know, I was really into that. And then when the Fleck Tones came out, I was, you know, but it's gotten hard to follow. There are so many good players today.
Yeah.
That I think
really
I'm reverting back to, like, I'm getting to where I like more hardcore traditional pickers these days. Like, I'm a big Third Time Out fan. I like that kind of banjo playing.
Right.
And the banjo players that Doyle Lawson will have.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm just really, because a lot of times what you're hearing Scruggs' licks and Scruggs' ideas, but it's recorded so beautifully and played so perfectly by some of these people.
Right.
And I'm a big Del McCurry fan and the boys.
Sure.
So that's kind of where I'm at. You know, I'm 59 years old, and you know.
Yeah, I know you could go all day listing for every player that you list that you really dig. There's probably 10 that you also love, who you're completely forgetting about at the moment.
I've been digging back through my record albums lately, and there are banjo players that I have forgotten about that I was like, wow, that joker was good. People like Pat Cloud, Marty Cutler, some of these people that were coming out in the 70s and 80s that are now forgotten. And man, you know, some of these guys today think that they're plowing new ground, but I'm telling you, a lot of that stuff has already been toyed with.
Well, I'm going to need to talk to you about that, because those recordings that you just talked about, those are difficult to find, because I have heard about those guys, and it's tough to get your hands on those, even if you're
I got
really
my hands on let me tell you how I got my hands on a whole bunch of them. When I was in college in 79 through 81, they had a college radio station, and it was a 10-watt FM station.
Okay.
That was it. It covered the campus.
The neighborhood, right?
This was at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College in Tifton. Well, the students ran the station. So I went down there and signed up to be a DJ. And so for a couple of years, I did a Sunday evening 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. bluegrass show called Bluegrass, Etc. And I was really into Grissman then. And I was dragging my records down to the station and playing David Grissman Quintet, stuff like this. But they had a pretty substantial library of records that were just mailed to the station, hundreds and hundreds, pretty much all the Rounder stuff, all the Rebel stuff.
Yeah,
these
cool.
record companies, they were on a mailing list, and they sent them to every station.
You just get the player promo version. Yeah,
I could go back there and grab 15 or 20 albums and spend that week listening to them and decide and bring them back to the station and play them on Sunday. Well, just as I was leaving the college, big announcement, the college station is switching over to Georgia Public Radio, and they're basically going to be on a feed, and there's this network of public radio stations in Georgia, and they all
I see where this is going. This is good.
They all have the same program. In other words, all you students, you're just going to turn on knobs and stuff. You're not actually going to have your own shows anymore. So you kick, and I got to thinking, they are never going to play these records again.
Yeah.
So I started carting them off. And I have hundreds of bluegrass records stamped, for promotional purposes only. They would stamp them and, void them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so they can't be on the shelf, right?
They were just going to throw them in the dumpster. So that's where I got all that stuff.
Oh, that's incredible.
Rescued from the encroaching public radio takeover. Hopefully the statute of limitations has run out on that theft, but I did walk off with a couple of hundred bluegrass records.
It's kind of amazing that you have that story. I have an almost identical one. I did the exact same thing. The student-run radio at Michigan State signed up to DJ, and I was never the host for the roots and bluegrass. In the studio, I'd kind of go back where all the records were, and we had already completely switched over to CDs and everything. So like you said, there's all these records that were never going to be used. So that's, I didn't really get to dive into those too much, but I remember picking out it was just when I was just getting into it. So I found a Flatt and Scruggs disc, or I found one of Jerry Douglas's early solo ones, Fluxology, something like that. And so
I've got that.
I discovered one or two things from there. Yeah.
I was buying records at the time too, and mostly to get bluegrass records, you went to festivals. And there would be these dealers there, with bins, and you'd go through them and buy them. And bands were selling. I've got a lot of records that, I bought off the guy sitting at the table next to me. We'd be at a festival peddling our record, and they're sitting there, or you'd swap. I've traded records with the guy sitting next to us. I got some Virginia Squires and Bluegrass Cardinals and stuff like that from being on the same festival with them. And, killing hours at a festival because you play for 45 minutes and then you man the record table for 5 hours, waiting on your next set.
Yeah, your next set.
And you're sitting there talking to Ricky Simpkins or, somebody like that and, handing stuff back and forth. Here, you want one of these? That kind of thing. So I did get a lot of stuff like that. I've got a lot of records that, frankly, I've never opened, never pulled the plastic off of,
Right.
CDs, it's the same thing. I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of CDs in there.
Yeah.
That many of them I probably listened to once. They're always my favorites that end up in the car, and I play those over and over and over. But it would take me I'd have to live 2 lifetimes to go back and listen to all that stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty overwhelming. That's the blessing and the curse of our modern digital age. You have access to so much stuff, and it's great, but it can be overwhelming, no doubt about it.
I miss the album days, though, because of first of all, the larger format, because I spent many hours just staring at record album, that jacket, like the Bean Blossom when it opened up. There's a big, giant I don't know how big they were, 13 inches square or something like that, opened up, and it's a giant picture of, the festival. And you just, because you didn't have anything else to do while you were listening to it, so you looked at the pictures and, and the booklets that they used to put in them. And now, the trend is single song download. So, it's just...
Yeah, I missed the liner notes. That's how I used to... I mean, I think I speak for everybody. That's how you discover new music, is you listen to an album. If somebody's really impressing you, hey, this mandolin player is really good, you figure out who it is, and then you figure out what else they've been on, and you discover new stuff that way. And it's
and there were some record companies, when I was getting started, that put almost nothing on the album. List of the tunes. Sometimes they wouldn't even tell you who the players were.
Okay.
Some of that old Star Day stuff, like the first Newgrass Revival album that I had, it didn't tell you anything, But then some of them were just, practically a book, Yeah. And I really like that when people put more information, about, I like that, 24-page CD booklet. Some of the stuff Grissman has put out, he's been very good about that, like the tone poems and
lots of information.
Anything he puts out, it's a true historical document.
Absolutely.
Well, I will just say this to all the listeners on both the Picky Fingers Banjo podcast side of this and also on the Grass Talk Radio side of this is go out and support live music. That's something we didn't mention, but without we've spent a lot of time talking about recording, but go out, go to jams, go to festivals, go see the bands. That's where it's at. If we don't do that, we're hurting the whole bluegrass and banjo picking world. Support live music. That's my final big plug right there.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. That's where the real value is at, is putting all of these tips that you're giving people and meeting all these interviewees that I'm hopefully introducing people to, put it into practice and go see them live, see what the big fuss is all about, and be part of it yourself. Definitely.
Yeah. Plus it's a whole lot more fun. I always tell people you can't do bluegrass sitting on your couch, unless you can get like the Bluegrass Album Band to come over to your house, but you got to get out, get in the truck and go, it's out there. And that's how we keep this thing going.
I keep waiting for them to show up, but for some reason they never do. So I guess I'll have to go.
Yeah, they don't drop by my house very often either.
All right, man. Well, hey, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. I'm sure we'll keep in touch, and best of luck to you with your podcast, and greetings to all your listeners, and to any of my listeners who haven't discovered Brad's podcast, go check out Grass Talk Radio. He does a great job, and there should be a lot of interesting things that he covers that I don't necessarily get to. So it's a good companion podcast.
You're very kind, Keith, and turn that back around and say, I love your podcast, and I look forward to the next episode. Maybe not this episode, but the one following this episode. Well, I'm sure it'll be much better than this one.
Just when you think you're done hearing your own voice with your own podcast, now you have to listen to it on somebody else's too.
I enjoyed it. Have a good day, and I'm sure we'll be glad to get this thing put to bed so you can get your banjo out and get to picking.
I hope so.
All right.
And that's going to do it for this episode of the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me once again. If you'd like to support the show, please go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/banjopodcast, to make a donation to help support what I do. If you'd like to contact the show, pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com. And I think that's all I need to say for now. Thank you once again, and I will see you on the next episode.